The summer rain painted gentle patterns across the windows of St. Mary's Hospital in London as Sarah Thompson held her newborn son for the first time. Marcus weighed 6 pounds and 2 ounces, with thick dark hair that stuck up in every direction and the most beautiful brown eyes she had ever seen. Like any new mother, Sarah counted his tiny fingers and toes, marveled at his perfect little nose, and whispered promises about all the adventures they would share together. She had no way of knowing that those tiny legs would never carry her son across a playground, up a flight of stairs, or into her arms when he called for her from across a room. The diagnosis wouldn't come for several months, and, when it did, it would shatter everything she thought she knew about their future. Dr. Patricia Webb had delivered hundreds of babies during her 20-year career, but something about the Thompson case troubled her from the beginning. During routine checkups, she noticed that Marcus wasn't reaching the typical milestones. At 6 months, when most babies were sitting up with support, Marcus showed little muscle tone in his lower body. His legs seemed unusually weak, and his reflexes weren't developing as expected. Sarah first noticed something was different when Marcus was 8 months old. She was sitting on the floor of their small apartment in East London, trying to encourage him to crawl toward a colorful toy truck. Other babies his age were already pulling themselves across the carpet, but Marcus only moved his arms. His legs remained still, as if they belonged to someone else entirely. "Maybe he's just taking his time," her husband David said one evening as they watched Marcus playing on his blanket. David worked 2 jobs to support their small family, days at a construction site and evenings cleaning offices. He was exhausted most of the time, but he always made time to play with his son when he got home. "Every baby develops at their own pace, right?" Sarah wanted to believe him, but a mother's instinct told her something was wrong. She scheduled an appointment with their family doctor, Dr. Harrison, who had been practicing medicine in their neighborhood for over 30 years. His gentle manner and white beard made children feel comfortable, but his expression grew serious as he examined Marcus. "I'd like to refer you to a specialist," Dr. Harrison said carefully, his hands gentle as he tested Marcus's reflexes. "There might be some developmental delays we should investigate further." The next few months became a blur of medical appointments, tests, and waiting rooms filled with other worried parents. Marcus underwent MRI scans, blood tests, and extensive neurological examinations. Each test brought new questions but few answers, and Sarah found herself memorizing the route to the children's hospital. Dr. Elizabeth Chen, a pediatric neurologist, finally provided the diagnosis that would change everything. Spina bifida, she explained, was a birth defect that occurred when the spine and spinal cord didn't form properly. In Marcus's case, the damage affected the nerves that controlled movement in his legs. "The good news," Dr. Chen said, her voice warm but honest, "is that Marcus's cognitive development is completely normal. He's a bright, alert baby with no intellectual disabilities. However, the likelihood of him walking independently is very small." Sarah felt the world tilt around her as she processed those words. She had imagined teaching Marcus to ride a bicycle, watching him play football with other children, dancing at his wedding someday. Now she was learning about wheelchairs, physical therapy, and a lifetime of medical care. David took the news even harder than Sarah expected. That night, she found him sitting in Marcus's room, holding their sleeping son and crying quietly. "I keep thinking about all the things I wanted to teach him," he whispered. "How to kick a football, how to run really fast, how to climb trees." "We'll find other things to teach him," Sarah said, though her own heart was breaking. "He's still our little boy. He's still perfect." The first year after the diagnosis was the hardest. Sarah quit her job at the local library to become Marcus's full-time caregiver. The family's finances became tight, but she couldn't bear the thought of leaving him with strangers who might not understand his needs. She learned to navigate insurance claims, medical equipment suppliers, and the complex world of disability services. Marcus, meanwhile, was developing into a remarkable little boy despite his challenges. He had an infectious laugh that could brighten any room, and he was incredibly social. When other children stared at his wheelchair, he would wave enthusiastically and try to strike up conversations. His vocabulary developed faster than most children his age, and he had an unusual gift for remembering faces and names. Physical therapy became a regular part of their routine. 3 times a week, Sarah would drive Marcus to the rehabilitation center where he worked with Emma, a physiotherapist who specialized in children with spina bifida. Emma was young and energetic, with bright red hair and a collection of silly songs that made therapy feel like playtime. The important thing to remember, Emma explained to Sarah during one of their sessions, is that we're not trying to force Marcus to walk. We're helping him develop the strongest possible core and upper body so he can be as independent as possible. Sarah watched as Emma helped Marcus practice transferring from his wheelchair to a mat on the floor. Even at 2 years old, Marcus approached each exercise with determination and curiosity. He never complained about the hard work, though Sarah could see the exhaustion in his eyes after each session. The wheelchair became part of Marcus's identity early on. Sarah and David saved for months to buy him a bright blue pediatric wheelchair that he could propel himself. Marcus loved the independence it gave him, and he quickly became skilled at maneuvering around their apartment and neighborhood. When Marcus turned 3, Sarah decided it was time to start thinking about preschool. She visited several schools in their area, but many of them weren't equipped to handle a child with special needs. Some had steps without ramps, others didn't have accessible bathrooms, and a few administrators seemed genuinely uncomfortable discussing accommodation. Finally, they found Sunshine Children's Center, a small preschool that had recently renovated their building to meet accessibility standards. The director, Mrs. Roberts, welcomed Marcus warmly and assured Sarah that they would do whatever was necessary to help him succeed. Marcus's first day of preschool was harder on Sarah than on him. She worried about how the other children would treat him, whether he would be able to participate in activities, and if the teachers would really understand his needs. But, when she picked him up that afternoon, Marcus was beaming with excitement. "Mummy, I made a friend," he announced. "Her name is Lucy and she has curly hair and she wants to race wheelchairs with me tomorrow." Lucy became Marcus's first real friend outside of family. She was a spirited 4-year-old who treated Marcus's wheelchair like the coolest toy she had ever seen. She would often ask to push him around the playground, and they developed elaborate games that incorporated his chair into their adventures. The other children at preschool followed Lucy's lead. Soon, Marcus was the center of attention during outdoor play, with children lining up for rides on his lap or asking to help push his chair. The teachers marveled at how naturally the children accepted him and how his presence seemed to bring out kindness and creativity in the entire class. As Marcus grew older, his personality continued to shine. He was funny, intelligent, and remarkably resilient. When adults spoke to him in the patronizing tone often reserved for children with disabilities, he would politely correct them or change the subject entirely. He had no patience for pity, but he appreciated genuine kindness and interest in his life. David gradually adjusted to their new reality as well. He learned to install ramps and grab bars in their home, and he became an expert at researching adaptive equipment. Most importantly, he discovered that there were still countless adventures he could share with his son. They went fishing at the local pond, with Marcus casting his line from his wheelchair. They attended football matches together, where Marcus became known for his encyclopedic knowledge of player statistics and his enthusiastic cheering. By the time Marcus was 5, the family had developed a comfortable routine. Sarah had started working part-time at the library again, thanks to Marcus being in school and their reliable network of caregivers. David had been promoted to a supervisory position at the construction company, which meant better pay and more regular hours. Marcus continued his physical therapy, though the focus had shifted from attempting to develop leg function to maximizing his independence and preventing secondary complications. Emma, his physiotherapist, had become like family over the years. She celebrated every milestone with them, from Marcus's first independent transfer to his mastery of wheelchair sports. "He has the strongest upper body I've seen in a child his age," Emma told Sarah one afternoon. "His determination is remarkable. Most kids his age get frustrated with the repetitive exercises, but Marcus treats each session like a challenge to conquer." Indeed, Marcus approached everything in his life with the same determined spirit. When he decided he wanted to learn to swim, Sarah enrolled him in adaptive swimming classes. When he expressed interest in art, they found painting classes designed for children with different abilities. When he became fascinated with cooking, Sarah taught him to prepare simple meals from his wheelchair height. The family's life wasn't without challenges. Medical expenses remained a constant concern, even with insurance. Their small apartment was cramped, and they dreamed of a house with more space and better accessibility features. Sometimes Sarah felt overwhelmed by the constant vigilance required to ensure Marcus's health and safety. There were also moments of profound sadness that caught Sarah off guard. Watching other children his age running and playing would sometimes trigger an unexpected wave of grief for the life she had imagined for her son. She joined a support group for parents of children with disabilities, where she learned that these feelings were normal and that grieving the loss of expectations was part of the journey. But there were many more moments of joy and wonder. Marcus's laugh remained infectious, his curiosity boundless, and his compassion for others remarkable. He often noticed when other children were left out or sad, and he had a gift for including everyone in his games and conversations. As Marcus's 6th birthday approached, Sarah began thinking about bigger adventures. They had never traveled far from London because of concerns about accessibility and medical needs. But Marcus had been asking about seeing the ocean, and she decided it was time to plan their first real family vacation. "Where do you want to go for your birthday, sweetheart?" she asked him one evening as she helped him get ready for bed. Marcus thought carefully before answering. "I want to see the Queen's Guards," he said. "The ones with the big hats. And maybe the Queen too, if she's not too busy." Sarah smiled. Of course her son would want to visit Buckingham Palace. He had always been fascinated by stories of knights and castles, and the royal guards represented everything magical and mysterious about those tales. "I think we can arrange that," she said, already mentally planning their trip to central London. She had no idea that this simple birthday wish would lead to the most extraordinary day of their lives, or that a chance encounter with one of those guards would change everything they thought they knew about what was possible. Marcus Thompson turned 8 years old on a bright Tuesday morning in late spring, surrounded by balloons, homemade chocolate cake, and the excited chatter of his friends from school. The small celebration in their East London apartment was filled with laughter and the kinds of memories that would last a lifetime. But, as evening approached and the last guests departed, Marcus's thoughts turned to the promise his mother had made weeks earlier. "Tomorrow we're really going to see the palace?" he asked for the 3rd time that day, his brown eyes wide with anticipation as Sarah helped him into his pajamas. "Tomorrow we're really going to see the palace," Sarah confirmed, smoothing down his still unruly hair. "And the guards with their big black hats, just like you wanted." Sleep didn't come easily for Marcus that night. He lay in his bed, staring at the ceiling and imagining what it would be like to see the famous guards up close. He had watched videos online of the changing of the guard ceremony, mesmerized by their perfect synchronization and unwavering composure. In his 8-year-old mind, they represented something magical and powerful, like real-life knights protecting a fairy tale castle. Sarah spent most of the evening researching accessibility information for Buckingham Palace and the surrounding area. She had learned over the years to plan meticulously for any outing with Marcus, considering everything from wheelchair-accessible transportation to the location of nearby restrooms. The last thing she wanted was for their special day to be ruined by logistical problems. David had taken the day off work, something that rarely happened during the week. The construction company was in the middle of a major project, but he had convinced his supervisor that his son's birthday trip couldn't wait for the weekend. Family time had become precious to David over the years, and he wasn't going to miss this milestone moment. The morning dawned clear and unusually warm for late May. Sarah packed a small backpack with snacks, water bottles, Marcus's medication, and a folding portable cushion for extended sitting. She had learned to prepare for every possibility during their outings, though she tried to keep her preparations discreet so Marcus wouldn't worry about potential problems. "Are you ready for your big adventure, birthday boy?" David asked as he helped Marcus transfer from his bed to his wheelchair. Over the years, David had become expert at assisting with transfers while maintaining Marcus's dignity and independence. It was a delicate balance that had taken time to master. Marcus was practically vibrating with excitement as they prepared to leave their apartment. He had chosen his favorite blue shirt for the occasion, the one with a small crown embroidered on the pocket that Sarah had found at a charity shop months earlier. His dark hair was combed neatly to one side, though Sarah knew it would be sticking up in all directions within an hour.
The journey from their neighborhood to central London took nearly an hour by public transport.
Sarah had mapped out the most accessible route, which involved taking a bus to the underground station and, then, switching to the tube. Marcus loved riding the underground, fascinated by the rush of air that preceded each arriving train and the diverse crowd of people traveling throughout the city. David carried Marcus down the stairs at their local station while Sarah managed the wheelchair, a routine they had perfected over years of navigating London's aging public transport system. While many stations had been updated with lifts, their local stop hadn't been modernized yet, making their journeys dependent on David's strength and willingness to help. Marcus pressed his face to the train window as they traveled through the tunnels, watching the lights flash by in hypnotic patterns. He struck up conversations with fellow passengers, as was his nature, asking questions about their destinations and sharing his excitement about visiting the palace. His enthusiasm was infectious, and soon several strangers were offering tips about the best spots to watch the guards and sharing their own memories of visiting royal sites. "The guards are very serious," explained an elderly woman sitting across from them.
"They're not allowed to smile or talk while they're on duty.
But don't worry, dear, they're quite friendly underneath all that formality."
"Do they ever get tired standing so still?"
Marcus asked, his scientific mind curious about the practical aspects of guard duty.
"I imagine they must," the woman replied. "But they're trained soldiers, so they're very strong and disciplined."
Marcus absorbed this information carefully, adding it to his growing collection of facts about the royal guards. He had always been fascinated by people who had jobs that required special skills or training, and the guards represented the ultimate example of professionalism and dedication in his young mind. As their train approached the central London stations, the crowd began to thicken with tourists carrying cameras and maps. Marcus observed the different languages being spoken around him and the various accents he could identify. His teacher had been working with the class on geography, and he enjoyed trying to guess where people might be visiting from based on their clothing and conversations. The transition from the underground to street level at Green Park Station went smoothly, with David again carrying Marcus while Sarah navigated the wheelchair up the stairs. The sun was shining brightly as they emerged onto Piccadilly, and Marcus blinked in the sudden daylight before getting his bearings.
"Which way to the palace, Dad?"
Marcus asked, craning his neck to look around at the tall buildings and busy streets. "Just down this way," David replied, pointing toward the direction of St. James's Park. "We'll walk through the park first, and then you'll be able to see the palace gates." The journey through St. James's Park was magical for Marcus. He had never seen so much green space in central London, and he was fascinated by the mix of local workers eating lunch on benches and tourists studying maps and guidebooks. The park's paths were smooth and well-maintained, making it easy for Sarah to push his wheelchair when his arms got tired from self-propelling. They stopped by the lake to watch the pelicans and ducks, and Marcus delighted in trying to identify the different species of birds they encountered. A group of school children on their own field trip gathered around Marcus when they noticed his encyclopedic knowledge of waterfowl, and soon he was leading an impromptu nature lesson for kids his own age. "How do you know so much about birds?" asked a girl with pigtails who seemed particularly impressed by Marcus's ability to distinguish between different types of ducks. "I read lots of books," Marcus explained matter-of-factly. "And I watch nature programs on television. When you can't run around as much as other kids, you have more time to learn about things." Sarah felt a familiar surge of pride mixed with heartache as she listened to her son's explanation. His matter-of-fact acceptance of his situation never ceased to amaze her, though she sometimes wondered if his resilience masked deeper feelings he didn't feel comfortable expressing. As they continued through the park toward Buckingham Palace, the number of tourists increased dramatically. Marcus found himself answering questions about directions and recommendations from visitors who assumed his family were locals. He enjoyed feeling helpful and knowledgeable, and David noticed how much confidence these interactions seemed to give him. "Look, there it is!" Marcus shouted suddenly, pointing ahead through the trees. Buckingham Palace emerged gradually through the foliage, its massive facade and iconic balcony becoming visible as they approached the main gates. Marcus fell silent for a moment, clearly overwhelmed by the scale and grandeur of the building. He had seen it in pictures and videos countless times, but experiencing it in person was entirely different.
The crowd gathered outside the palace gates was larger than Sarah had anticipated. Tourists pressed against the iron railings, cameras clicking constantly as they tried to capture the perfect shot of the building and any guards who might be visible. Street performers entertained the waiting crowds, and vendors sold souvenirs from portable stands stationed along the sidewalk. Marcus surveyed the scene with wide eyes, taking in every detail. He was particularly fascinated by the international nature of the crowd, listening to conversations in languages he couldn't identify and observing the different styles of clothing and photography equipment people had brought for their visit. "Where are the guards?" Marcus asked, scanning the visible areas around the palace entrance. "They'll be inside the gatehouse and around the perimeter," David explained. "The ceremony doesn't start for another hour, but we might see some of them at their posts if we're patient." They found a spot along the fence where Marcus could position his wheelchair for an optimal view of the palace entrance and the famous balcony above. Sarah spread a small blanket on the ground beside him, and they settled in for what might be a long wait. The anticipation was part of the adventure, and Marcus seemed content to observe the activity around them while they waited for the main event. As they waited, Marcus struck up conversations with other families in the crowd. He met children from Australia, Germany, and Japan, all of whom were visiting London for the first time. His natural curiosity about their home countries led to animated discussions about different cultures, foods, and customs. Sarah marveled at his ability to connect with people despite language barriers and cultural differences. A young couple from Canada, noticing Marcus's wheelchair and his obvious excitement about the upcoming ceremony, offered to help ensure he had the best possible view when the guards appeared. They positioned themselves strategically to prevent taller adults from blocking his sightline, a small kindness that touched Sarah deeply. "Is this your first time seeing the guards?" the woman asked Marcus, her voice warm and friendly. "Yes, it's my birthday present," Marcus replied proudly. "I'm 8 years old today, and I've wanted to see them my whole life." "Well, you picked a perfect day for it," the man said. "The weather is beautiful, and there should be a good ceremony." As the time for the changing of the guard approached, the crowd grew larger and more animated. Marcus found himself surrounded by a multicultural group of well-wishers who had collectively decided to ensure the birthday boy had the best possible experience. Sarah watched in amazement as strangers coordinated their positions to give Marcus clear sightlines and shared their own snacks and water with their small family. The first glimpse of the approaching guards sent a ripple of excitement through the crowd. Marcus heard the sound of marching feet and military drums before he could see the soldiers themselves, and the rhythm created a sense of anticipation that made his heart race with excitement. "Here they come," someone in the crowd called out, and Marcus pressed himself forward in his wheelchair, determined not to miss a single moment of the ceremony he had been dreaming about for months. The sound of approaching drums grew stronger, creating a rhythmic heartbeat that seemed to pulse through the crowd gathered outside Buckingham Palace. Marcus gripped the armrests of his wheelchair, his knuckles white with excitement and anticipation. After months of dreaming about this moment, he was finally about to witness the famous changing of the guard ceremony in person. The first contingent of guards appeared around the corner, their red tunics blazing in the afternoon sunlight and their black bearskin hats adding an extra foot to their already imposing height. They moved in perfect synchronization, their movements precise and choreographed like an elaborate dance that had been performed countless times over generations. Marcus was transfixed. He had watched videos of this ceremony online, but experiencing it in person was completely different. The sound of their boots striking the pavement created a rhythm that he felt in his chest, and the sight of their unwavering expressions and military bearing made them seem like figures from a storybook come to life. "Look at how straight they stand," Marcus whispered to his father, his voice filled with awe. "They don't even blink." David nodded, though he found himself watching his son's reaction more than the ceremony itself. The pure joy and wonder on Marcus's face was worth every challenge they had overcome to make this trip happen. This was the kind of moment that made all the difficult days worthwhile. As the ceremony proceeded, Marcus became increasingly animated, pointing out details to the other children around him and asking David questions about the significance of various movements and commands. His enthusiasm was contagious, and soon several adults in the vicinity were listening to his running commentary with amused smiles. The formal ceremony lasted about 30 minutes,
with guards marching back and forth, exchanging positions, and executing complex drill movements with military precision. When the main event concluded, many tourists began to disperse, but Marcus remained planted in his spot, hoping to catch a closer glimpse of the guards who remained at their posts.
"Can we stay a little longer?"
Marcus asked his mother, his eyes still fixed on the palace gates where two guards had taken up their positions for the afternoon shift. "Of course we can," Sarah replied, though she was already thinking about the logistics of their return journey and Marcus's need for regular medication.
"Just for a while longer."
The crowd had thinned considerably, creating a more intimate atmosphere around the palace gates. Marcus found himself with a much clearer view of the two guards stationed at the entrance, and he studied them with the intensity of a scientist observing a fascinating specimen. Guard James Mitchell had been serving in the Queen's Guard for 3 years, but he had never quite gotten used to the feeling of being observed like a living statue. The heavy bearskin hat, formal red tunic, and rigid posture were all part of a tradition that stretched back centuries, and he took his role seriously. At 25 years old, he was one of the younger members of his unit, but his military training and natural discipline made him well suited for the demanding position. As James stood at his post that afternoon, maintaining the required stillness and stoic expression, he became aware of a young boy in a wheelchair who seemed particularly fascinated by the guards. Unlike most tourists who took a few photos and moved on, this child remained positioned nearby, watching with an intensity that was both flattering and slightly unnerving. Marcus had positioned his wheelchair as close to the gates as the barriers would allow, and he was studying every detail of the guards' uniforms and equipment. He noticed the intricate details of their brass buttons, the perfect alignment of their white belts, and the impressive height of their ceremonial hats. Most importantly, he observed their unwavering composure and dedication to their duty.
"Mummy," Marcus said quietly, not wanting to disturb the guards but unable to contain his curiosity, "do you think they get tired standing so still for so long?"
Sarah glanced at the guards, who showed no sign of having heard Marcus's question or being aware of his presence.
"I imagine they must," she replied.
"But they're very well trained, so they know how to handle it." Marcus continued to watch, fascinated by what seemed like superhuman self-control. He began to imagine what it would feel like to have that kind of strength and discipline. In his young mind, these guards represented everything he aspired to be: strong, reliable, and unshakable in the face of any challenge. After about 20 minutes of observation, Marcus made a decision that would change everything. He had been sitting quietly in his wheelchair, but suddenly, he began to shift his position, trying to move from sitting to a standing position using the armrests of his chair for support.
Sarah noticed immediately what her son was attempting to do.
"Marcus, sweetheart, what are you doing?" she asked gently, moving closer to his chair. "I want to stand like the guards," Marcus explained, his voice determined but strained with effort.
"I want to see if I can be strong like them."
Marcus had never been able to stand independently in his 8 years of life. His spina bifida had left him without functional use of his legs, and, while he had developed incredible upper body strength, standing without support had always been medically impossible. Yet something about watching the guards had inspired him to try something that every doctor had told his family would never happen. James Mitchell, despite his training to remain motionless and unresponsive during his duty, couldn't help but notice the commotion developing nearby. Through his peripheral vision, he could see the boy in the wheelchair attempting to stand, and he watched as the child's parents moved closer with expressions of concern and encouragement. Marcus managed to push himself up from his wheelchair seat using his arms, but his legs wouldn't support his weight, and he began to wobble precariously. David moved quickly to spot him, ready to catch him if he fell, while Sarah knelt beside the wheelchair to provide additional support. "I want to try," Marcus said, his voice filled with determination despite the obvious difficulty of what he was attempting.
"The guards make it look so easy to be strong."
It was at this moment that something extraordinary happened. James Mitchell, trained to remain absolutely still and ignore all distractions during his duty, made a split-second decision that went against every protocol he had learned. He broke his rigid stance and took a step toward the family. "Excuse me," James said quietly, his voice gentle but carrying the authority of his position.
"I couldn't help but notice your son's determination."
Sarah and David looked up in surprise. They had never heard of a Queen's Guard breaking protocol to speak with tourists, and they weren't sure how to respond. Marcus, meanwhile, was staring at the guard with wide eyes, amazed that one of these statue-like figures had actually spoken to him. "He wants to stand like you," Sarah explained, uncertain whether she should be encouraging this interaction or trying to move Marcus away to avoid getting the guard in trouble. James looked down at Marcus, seeing something in the boy's eyes that reminded him of his own determination to succeed in military training despite various obstacles he had faced. There was a recognition between them, one person who understood challenge and perseverance acknowledging another. "Standing strong isn't just about your legs," James said, kneeling down to Marcus's eye level, his formal demeanor softening without losing its inherent dignity. "It's about your heart, your mind, and your spirit. From what I can see, you're already stronger than most people I know." Marcus listened intently to every word, absorbing not just the meaning but the tone of respect in the guard's voice. No one had ever spoken to him about strength in quite this way before, and he felt something shift inside him as he processed what he was hearing. "But I can't walk," Marcus said matter-of-factly, without self-pity but with the straightforward honesty that characterized most of his conversations about his disability. "Neither could one of my fellow guards when he was your age," James replied. "He had an accident that damaged his legs, but he trained and worked until he could serve in the Queen's Guard. Different people find different ways to be strong." Sarah felt tears begin to form in her eyes as she listened to this unexpected conversation. She had spent years trying to help Marcus understand that his worth wasn't defined by his physical limitations, but somehow this guard was conveying that message in a way that seemed to resonate deeply with her son. "Would you like to try standing with some help?" James asked Marcus. "Sometimes we all need support to do difficult things." Marcus nodded eagerly, and James positioned himself on one side while David took the other. Together, they helped Marcus rise from his wheelchair, supporting his weight while allowing him to experience the sensation of standing upright. For the first time in his life, Marcus was eye-level with standing adults. He looked around from this new perspective, seeing the world from a height he had never experienced before. The feeling was simultaneously thrilling and overwhelming, and he laughed with pure joy at this impossible moment. "How does it feel?" James asked, maintaining his supportive grip while allowing Marcus to experience as much independence as possible. "Like flying," Marcus said, his voice filled with wonder. "Like I'm tall enough to see everything." They held the position for nearly a minute, with Marcus experiencing the physical sensation of standing while James and David provided the necessary support. Sarah captured the moment with her camera, though she found herself crying too hard to see clearly through the viewfinder. As they gently helped Marcus back into his wheelchair, James remained kneeling beside him. "Remember," he said seriously, "real strength comes from in here." He pointed to Marcus's chest, and in here, he pointed to his head. "Your legs don't make you weak, and standing doesn't make someone strong. It's what you do with the abilities you have that matters." Marcus nodded solemnly, understanding that he was receiving wisdom that went far beyond the simple act of standing up. This guard had seen something in him that he was just beginning to recognize in himself, the potential for a different kind of strength than he had ever imagined. The encounter lasted only a few minutes, but its impact would last a lifetime. James returned to his post, resuming his formal stance and stoic expression, while Marcus and his family remained nearby for a while longer, processing what had just occurred. As they prepared to leave the palace grounds, Marcus turned back for one final look at the guard who had changed his understanding of what it meant to be strong. James, though he couldn't acknowledge Marcus with any gesture while on duty, somehow conveyed through his presence that this moment had been meaningful for him as well. The journey home from Buckingham Palace was unlike any trip the Thompson family had ever taken together. Marcus sat quietly in his wheelchair as they navigated the crowded underground stations, but his silence wasn't the usual fatigue that followed a long day out. Instead, he seemed to be processing something profound, his young mind working through the implications of what had just occurred. "Did that really happen?" Marcus asked suddenly, as their train pulled away from Green Park Station. "Did the guard really help me stand up?" "It really happened," David confirmed, his voice still carrying traces of the amazement he had felt during those extraordinary moments. "I've never seen anything like it in my life." Sarah reached over and squeezed Marcus's hand gently. She had been trying to find words to express what she was feeling, but everything seemed inadequate compared to the magnitude of what they had just experienced. The image of her son standing upright, supported by a Queen's Guard who had broken protocol to help a child fulfill a dream, would be born in a world where miracles seem impossible and hope feels distant. Sometimes the most extraordinary moments come from the most unexpected places.
What happens when duty meets compassion? When protocol gives way to humanity? When a trained soldier becomes an instrument of healing? This is not just another heartwarming story. This is the true account of how one royal guard's simple act of kindness created a miracle that doctors said would never happen. It's about an 8-year-old boy named Marcus whose legs had never carried him, a family whose faith was hanging by a thread, and a moment that would prove that sometimes the most powerful medicine isn't found in hospitals or clinics. The day started like any other at Buckingham Palace. Tourists gathered, cameras clicked, and the royal guards stood at their posts with unwavering discipline. But, by sunset, everything had changed. A wheelchair, a desperate mother's plea, and one guard's decision to break protocol would create a moment so powerful that it would be remembered forever. This is the story of Marcus Thompson, his family's journey through darkness, and the day when hope took human form in a red uniform and tall black hat.